by just doing an exercise for old time's sake. So, what would be a good one? Yeah, turn to page 250. All right, let's put it all together. So, I will allow you to speak this class. I will stop being so mean to you. Could you read number 7, top of page 250?
Some of the proposals before this committee, I have to conclude, are not inspired. All of the proposals are reasonable, but some of the inspired ideas are not reasonable.
Okay. First of all, what do we have to do? That's right. What is the conclusion, Don?
Some of the proposals before this committee are not inspired things.
Yes, actually it's inspired ideas, as we'll see later. Okay, can we see that? Yes. All right, so with letters and words, what is the conclusion?
Some S are not P.
Some S are not P. And what is S in this particular instance then?
Ideas before the committee.
Or proposals, yes.
Committee.
Proposals before the committee. I'm going to be lazy and just write proposals, but you're not allowed to be lazy. So what is P then?
Inspired ideas.
Inspired ideas, that's right. Which by a process of elimination tells us what is M.
Reasonable ideas.
Or does it say ideas or things?
Propositions? Proposals?
No, not proposals. We've got proposals already. Reasonable.
Reasonable.
Reasonable things. Reasonable things. Okay then. Ethan, what is the major premise as it's written here?
Some inspired ideas are not reasonable things.
Okay, so in letters,
Some S are not P. I mean, some P are not F.
some P, because it's some inspired ideas, are not M reasonable things. Now, how do you know that's the major premise?
Because it includes P.
It included the major term, which is P, and it was talking about inspired ideas. So, Josh, that leaves what as the minor premise?
All the proposals are reasonable.
So all
S are M.
all S are M. Good. All right. Now let's work out the mood plus figure of this. When I say give me the mood, I want you to give me 3 letters like this. 1, 2, 3. Go.
O, A, O. 2, 3.
I didn't ask for the number yet. Jumping the gun. But you're right. O, A, O. The major premise is O. The minor premise is A, and the conclusion is O. Okay, now we have to draw our little spiky hair, which clumps in the middle, to work out the figure. And everybody, the figure is
2.
2. Yes, because both the M's are on the right, so it's 2. Now we want to work out whether or not this particular form, OAO2, is valid. Either it's valid or it isn't valid. If it's valid, then everything of this form, whether it be talking about proposals or elephants or what have you, will be valid. If it's not, then none of them will be valid. Let's start with the rules. Karen, what is the first rule of validity?
The middle term must be distributed in at least one premise.
Very good. Is the middle term distributed here in the minor premise?
No.
Why is that, everybody?
It's not good.
You're right. It's not. because the middle term here is the predicate of the minor premise. And what is the rule for when the predicate is distributed? When it's negative, but this is not negative. So this middle term is not distributed. What about here in the major premise?
Yes, it is.
Yes, because again it's the predicate, and in this case the proposition is negative. So does it pass rule number 1? Yes, because it is the middle term is distributed here. All right, Kent, what is rule 2?
It's distributed in the conclusion has to be distributed in the premise with each include.
Very good. Let's look at S. Is S distributed, everybody? No is the answer. Why not? It's the subject, and what's the rule for the subject? Must be universal, but this one is particular. So what does that mean?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It means if the rule just says if it's distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. If it's not distributed, we don't care. We move on. What about P? Is P distributed, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, because the categorical proposition is negative. All right. So what do?
We check if one of the premises is,
We check in, it'll be the major premise. We check to see if the major term is distributed here in the major premise, and is it?
No.
No. So this commits what fallacy?
Illicit major.
Illicit major, that's right. Because illicit major means the major term is distributed in the conclusion, but not in the major premise. Why is that a fallacy? What's wrong with that? It's to do with the nature of validity. An argument is valid when the premises guarantee the conclusion. Why does this fact mean that that can't happen? Yes, Doug.
The conclusion speaks of all P, while the the major premise does not speak of all P.
Exactly. So any information, if the premises are going to guarantee the conclusion, then any information that is in the conclusion has to also be in the premises. What do we know about distribution? A term is distributed if the proposition is saying something about every member of it. So the conclusion is saying something about every member of P. Well, if the conclusion is doing that, that has to happen in the premises. Otherwise, the premises can't guarantee the conclusion. But it's not happening. So those premises cannot guarantee that conclusion. All right, so we know this is invalid. Incidentally, does this pass rules 3 and 4?
Yes.
What's rule 3?
Can't both be negative. Both premises cannot both be negative.
Yes, and one of them is affirmative. What about rule 4? If the conclusion is negative, one of the premises has to be negative, and that happens. Okay, so it only fails on rule 2, but too bad, that's all you need. What is another way to test this for validity, just to make sure we're right? Venn diagram. All right, help me out. What do I do? Talk me through this.
Draw the conclusion first,
How?
by putting S and P, 2 circles.
2 circles
That overlap each other.
that overlap each other. Good. S and P. All right. Let's diagram the conclusion right away. What am I doing? Shading or putting an X? Because it's particular. Am I putting it in one? Am I putting it in the left moon, the cat's eye, or the right moon? Left moon. Who agrees? Because it's some S, so it has to be in the S circle, so it has to be 1 or 2. But it's not in P, so it has to be 1. Incidentally, talking of moons, who saw the eclipse of the moon?
Missed it.
Who knew there was one?
I knew there was one.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. It was just the, sort of a reddish color. It wasn't that big of a deal. You didn't miss much. All right. Now what? What was that? Draw another diagram with M's. What does the diagram look like?
3 interlocking.
3 interlocking circles, so like this, kind of like Audi.
No.
Like the Led Zeppelin.
Well, that makes perfect sense. Okay, now I know what you're talking about. Okay. Bit small, but never mind. All right. What is this going to represent? This thing here, what is it going to represent? Premises. All right. Now, I have to diagram the premises. Does it matter what order I diagram them in?
Yes.
Which one should I diagram first?
Universal first.
Universal. In this case, which one is universal?
The minor premise.
A minor premise. So if I'm just focusing on S and M. All S are M. Am I going to be shading or putting an X?
Shading.
Because it's universal. Am I going to be shading the bottom moon, that is S but not M? Am I going to, or the cat's eye, or the top moon? That's fascinating stuff. Obviously you did stay on to see them. Or for some other reason. Alright, yes, the bottom moon. And notice that I have to shade an entire moon shape. There we go. Now, I diagram the major premise. So I focus on M and P. Am I going to be shading or putting an X? Shading or putting an X? X, because it's particular. Some P are not M. Am I putting it in the bottom moon, the cat's eye, or the top moon? Bottom moon, vote for bottom moon. Yes? Okay. Now, normally, where in this bottom moon here would I be putting my X? What's that? Which line? So this line, the line of S, in other words. Am I going to do that now?
No.
Why not?
S is there.
Because I normally put it on the line to indicate that I don't know whether it's in this region that is part of S or if it's outside of S. But I do know now. Why do I know?
Because S is empty.
Because we've already shaded it, so we know it can't be in there because that's empty, so it has to be in this remaining region. But it doesn't matter because this argument is invalid. Why? What's that? No, that's not the reason. That's not the reason this is invalid. In fact, the shading doesn't matter in this case. What do? I focus on the conclusion, and I look at the information in the conclusion. The information in the conclusion, where there's no shading or X's, you ignore. That's not information. That's absence of information. So the only information is that there's an X in this region. That's the information of the conclusion. So now what do?
You have to see if there's equal or more information in the
Right, I just want to see if there is that information in the premises. So I just look at this part of the diagram, and what am I looking for? An X. Is there an X in there? No. So therefore, there is something in the conclusion that is not in the premises, so the premises cannot guarantee this conclusion, so it's invalid. Okay? Yeah? Be totally happy and content with categorical syllogisms? We ready to move on?
I have a question.
Yes.
So you said do the universal first and do the premises.
Right.
But what if they're both particular?
Then it doesn't matter what order you do them. So the order only matters if you've got a mix. If they're both universal, well, it doesn't matter the order. And if they're both particular, it doesn't matter the order. It's only if you have a combination. Okay, easy question to answer. I like those. All right. You, of course, have to do stuff about these diagrams on your next homework, which I will post sometime later today. But now we are going to move on to the next chapter. The next chapter concerns more types of argument. Yes, well, actually, it is more types of argument. More types of proposition. So we have spent what seems like an age talking about first categorical propositions and then categorical syllogisms. How much time did we actually spend? It was like 5 classes or something like that, wasn't it? Well, now we're going to talk about 2 other kinds of proposition and 2 other kinds of syllogism. Fortunately, it's not going to take half as much time as talking about the categorical stuff. Because the categorical stuff is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more to it. There's 4 types of categorical proposition. There are these logical relationships amongst them. There's a million different ways of saying categorical propositions. in non-standard form. You have to learn all that stuff. We are now going to talk about hypothetical propositions and syllogisms, and before that, disjunctive propositions and syllogisms. So, these are, just as categorical propositions were a kind of proposition that had interesting logical properties, so disjunctive propositions and hypothetical propositions are a kind of proposition that also have interesting logical properties. Now, let's get this out of the way. Let's start with disjunctive propositions. The good news is, this is easy. Disjunctive propositions are pretty simple. It's a big word for something simple. A disjunctive proposition consists of two smaller propositions, let's call them A and B, joined by what in logic we call the disjunction. Now in grammar, slightly confusingly, you would call this an example of a conjunction, because grammar just cares about its grammatical role, and its grammatical role is joining two sentences together. But logically, it has a different effect from the thing that in logic we call a conjunction, which is the word and. So in logic, we reserve the word conjunction for and things that function like and, like although, or but. But in logic, the disjunction is the word or. We call that a disjunction. Now, that's it. That's a disjunctive proposition. It is one proposition. Now notice, I'm using letters to represent these propositions. Slightly confusingly, we used letters, S, M, and P, to represent terms when we were talking about categorical propositions. Terms are not propositions. Terms don't have truth value. Terms are things like whales and mammals. They don't have truth value. These things represent propositions. So this would be something like today is Wednesday, and this would be something like last night there was an eclipse. Okay? So they're things with truth value. So a disjunctive proposition is two other propositions that themselves could have truth value, do have truth value, joined together with the word or to make a larger proposition which itself has truth value. Alright? Now we're going to call these two smaller propositions disjuncts, which is an odd word. A lot of consonants joined together. Disjuncts. A and B are both disjuncts. And sometimes a disjunctive proposition will begin with what word?
Either.
Either, yes. Either, either, neither, neither. Yes. So either is what I will later call a herald word, which refers to a word that itself does not have logical properties, but it heralds the arrival of a word that does. So in this case, either acts as a herald for or, something that announces, here comes or, pretty soon, get ready. But itself, it's kind of redundant. It's like an indicator word. Just as indicator words are clues about something, but they themselves don't have a logical role, same works for these herald words. All right. I think we spent at least 2 classes talking about categorical propositions. That's pretty much all there is to say about disjunctive propositions. There is one more thing to say, which is that although they don't really come in non-standard form. In categorical propositions, for example, we had the problem, a whale is a mammal turned out to be an A-type. You translated it to all whales are mammals. A whale was beached in San Francisco, turned out to be an I-type. So you had non-standard types and you had to work out how to translate them. That doesn't really happen with disjunctive propositions. with the one proviso that it turns out the disjunctive propositions are logically equivalent to some sentences that don't have the word or in them. And we'll see an example of that when we do the exercises. But let's now talk about disjunctive syllogisms. What's a syllogism?
Two-premise argument?
A two-premise argument. That's right. I'll sit it over here. Okay. Now, there's a difference. Actually, let's just, yeah. There's a difference between disjunctive syllogisms and categorical syllogisms. In categorical syllogisms, how many of the three propositions were categorical propositions? All three of them were. Whereas in disjunctive syllogisms, even though there's three propositions to make them up, only the first one is a disjunctive proposition or disjunction. The others are not. I will give you an example of an apparent disjunctive syllogism. A or B, second premise A, conclusion, well, you tell me the conclusion. Suppose I were to say, either there are coins or keys in my pocket. Oh, it's coins. What's my conclusion?
Coins are in your pocket.
Well, no, that's already stated.
There are no keys.
It's not keys. So that would be, in this case, not B. A or B, it is A, so it's not B. Now, what I've written out here is there are four possible combinations. If we start with a disjunction, there are four possible ways we could go. We could say, so we start with A or B, we say A, and we conclude not B. Or we could say B and conclude not A. Or we could say what? Not A, and conclude B. Or finally, we could say not B, and conclude A. Those are the four possibilities. Well, actually, only two out of those are valid. And there's a reason for that. And the reason has, although certainly in the way we speak normally, all four of them look valid. And I can give examples where it seems definite that they're valid. But here's the reason why only two of them are. There are two ways that you can understand the word or. There are two senses of the word or. One of them, which is probably the more common usage of the word or, is called exclusive or. Two senses of or. First one is exclusive. If or is being used in the exclusive sense between A and B, then it is saying that one and only one of the two disjuncts is true. In other words, it's saying it can't both be true. That's why it's called exclusive. The truth of one excludes the possibility of the truth of the other. So, for example, if I were to say heads or tails, why does the fact that it's heads mean that it's not tails? Because we know what is true of coins, and if it's heads, the head side is facing up and the tail side has to be facing down. So that's a clear case where the nature of things means that the truth of one excludes the truth of the other. Okay, but alternatively, there's this other usage of the word or, which is inclusive. And according to the inclusive use of the word or, at least one disjunct is true, and possibly both. Possibly both. In other words, it's possible that both A and B can be true at the same time. Let me give an example where that might seem intuitive. Suppose I'm to peek out the door, you can't see, and I say, oh, Miley Cyrus just twerked down the hallway. Either I'm insane, or that was Miley Cyrus. Is it possible that they're both true?
Sure.
Yes, it could have been Miley Cyrus, and I could be stark raving mad. This was a rare moment of lucidity. The fact that I'm mad is illustrated by the fact that I'm not surprised, because I see things like that all the time. Okay, so that would be an example where it makes sense to say that they could both be true. All right, here's the deal. In logic, now notice, exclusive seems to make sense in a special range of cases where, by the way the world is set up, the truth of one excludes the truth of the other, like heads and tails. We know what coins are like. If one side shows, the other one can't. But in logic, we're just, a lot of the time, we're just dealing with letters. And we don't even know what the letters represent. So for all we know, these have nothing to do with each other. It's like me being insane and Miley Cyrus being in our hallway. Those two are logically independent of each other, unlike heads and tails. So that's why they could both be true at the same time. Because that's what we're dealing with in logic, we always assume the inclusive sense. So from this day forward in class, whenever we say or, we mean or in the inclusive sense. Okay? If we want to capture some kind of exclusion, we can do it in a slightly more convoluted way. But the word or means, if I'm saying A or B, what I'm saying is, at least one of them is true, but possibly both. With that in mind, which two of these, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which two of these are not valid? 1 and 2. Who said that? Okay, why, Brian?
Because it's A or B, and you're saying that because it's A, it can't be B, but it's not inclusive if you're saying that?
Yes, this says, so this says, at least one is true. And you say, well, A is true. Does that rule out the possibility of B being true? No. So both of these could be true without guaranteeing this conclusion, which means it's not valid. Because in a valid argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So this is not valid, because we are understanding or inclusively. It would be valid in the exclusive sense, right? If this was exclusive and it says A or B, that means it can only be one. So if it's this one, it can't be the other. But now that we're using it inclusively, that's not valid. And so obviously, this is the same kind of thing. So the only valid forms, write this down, I can't be bothered, I'm too lazy. The valid form for disjunctive syllogism is where the second premise denies a disjunct of the first premise. I'll say that again. The valid form for disjunctive syllogism is where the second premise denies one of the disjuncts of the first premise. In other words, so the disjuncts are A and B. If the second premise denies A or denies B, then it's a valid argument, provided your conclusion is correct. Okay, sure. The valid form for disjunctive syllogism is when the second premise denies one of the disjuncts of the first premise. And that's all you really need to know about disjunctive syllogism. So again, a lot easier than categoricals. In categoricals there were what, 16 valid forms? In disjunctive there's basically 2. And you don't need a whole apparatus of Venn diagrams or whatnot for working it out. Let's do some exercises. turn to page, bless you, 285. Okay. To whom did we get? It said correctly. Kat, did you do something? Okay. Zainab. All right. Could you read the first one, please?
Either I'm hearing things or someone is out in the hill singing renewables. I know I'm not hearing things, so there is someone out there singing.
All right. What we're going to do in this exercise is something that we've sort of done something like it before, but we're going to be doing a hell of a lot of this from this point forward. And that is, we're going to be symbolizing. What symbolizing is you go through sentences of natural language. The language we're going to use is English, because I'm not proficient in any other. And we're going to turn them into statements of formal logic, symbolic logic. Now that sounds more complicated than it is. Essentially, here's what it involves. We're going to replace what is it with people? Stop sneezing. Stop it right now, everybody. No more sneezing. We're going to replace every component proposition, that is simple proposition that can't be broken down any further, with a letter. And then we're going to replace logically significant words with the appropriate symbol. Well, so far we have learned 2 logically significant words. Well, actually we've learned 3, but let's start with these 2. Or. Here is the logical symbol for or. A little v, sometimes called a wedge. Okay? We have also learned that not is logically significant. We are going to use this symbol to represent not. Anyone know what that's called?
Tilde.
Tilde. Very good. Not tilde, even though it looks like it if you're used to Spanish pronunciation. T-I-L-D-E. It's pronounced tilde. I don't know why. It's probably German. And they pronounce their E's like that. Okay. With that in mind, let's symbolize the first argument. So, one of the propositions is, I'm hearing things. Let's use H for that. So this is question 1. H.
So why don't we use P and Q?
Well, we could, but I think it's a little more intuitive to use letters that remind us of what they stand for. So we could use any letters. So any letters could stand for the proposition. But, you know, it just helps you. If you use H earlier on, you'll remember that stands for hearing things. So when you see it later on in the argument, you'll say, oh, I used H to stand for that. Whereas if I just used P for it, I say, what was P again? I can't remember what it stood for. Okay?
So they're just variables.
Yes. Yes, they are. But I only use that word because it scares the math folks. All right. H. So what next, Zena?
Someone is out in the hill singing.
So little v for or, and let's use S. Now, the reason, I'm going to be very picky about this. What does S stand for? No, this is me being picky. There is a reason, it is S because of the word singing. That's why I picked S. However, each of these represents a proposition. What do propositions have? Truth value. Does singing have truth value? No. So what does S stand for?
Someone is
Someone's
out
out in the hall singing.
Exactly. Someone is out in the hall singing. Rant over. But that's important to remember, because we did use letters to stand for terms, like frogs. But now we're using them to stand for entire propositions that can be true or false. All right. Zayn, what is the second premise? That's the first premise. So that's the premise that says, either I'm hearing things or someone is out in the hall singing jingle bells.
So the second one, I'm not hearing things.
How are we going to symbolize that? Well, the tilde comes before it, so yes. Not H. We are the denial of H, tilde H, yes. And then we draw a line, and under that we write the conclusion, and what is the conclusion?
Someone out there saying, so S.
S. And there we have symbolized that little disjunctive syllogism. That's its form laid bare. That is the form of it. Either that form is valid or it's not valid. Now we've removed the content. The content is what these letters stand for. We can remember that if we like, but we don't need to work out whether or not it's valid. We just need that. Is it valid, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Why is it valid? Because it's one of the valid forms. And the simple way to tell is the second premise denying one of the disjuncts? Yes. The disjunct is H and it's saying not H. So that is a valid disjunctive syllogism. Make sense? Kind of blissfully easy after all that categorical stuff? I hope so. Alright. Number 2. Brandy.
I have to get the book here in town or else in New York next weekend. But I can't get it here, therefore I will have to get it in New York.
The days before Amazon.com. If you want to get a book, you better hurry, because I'm sure Barnes & Noble is going out of business soon. All right. Symbolize the disjunctive proposition.
B for book.
Well, actually, they both involve book.
Oh.
How about T for town?
Okay. And then
The little V?
the little B sign for New York.
So N?
So N.
Okay. So that stands for I have to get the book here in town or in New York next weekend. What's the second premise?
I can't get it here, so not T.
Yes, not T. I can't get it in town. Conclusion? Did somebody say E?
Choose that name. Yeah.
N. Oh, N. Okay. Yes, that's right. I was going to say, introducing new letters at this point. Not allowed. Yes, N. All right, there it is. That's the form. Is it valid or not? Everybody?
Yes.
Yes. Valid. Okay. So far, so easy peasy. Okay. Number 3. Hunter.
Either I'm out of money or I made a mistake in my checkbook. I'm sure I made a mistake, though, so I'm not out of money.
Oh, this is called wishful thinking. All right. Symbolize away.
The first one is M for money.
Actually, let's use O for out of, because we're going to want, what are we going to want M for?
Mistake.
Mistake. So O, V, M. I'm out of money or I made a mistake. Second premise.
Tilde.
Tilde, well, why?
Because it's not, right?
Is it? Where's the not? So either I'm out of money or I made a mistake. I'm sure I made a mistake. Doesn't sound like any notting going on there. So it is M. It's just M for mistake. And then the conclusion is I'm not out of money. It's tilde O. That's where the not ended up.
Whoops.
So, is it valid? Yes or no?
No.
No, it is not valid because it doesn't deny one of the disjuncts, it agrees with it. What mistake is this poor checkbook balancer making?
Supposing.
Well, usually, yes, but if I told that person that, that probably wouldn't be much help. How can I explain their error to them?
You can make a mistake, but also be out.
Yes, both of these can be true at once, so because one is true, you can make a mistake and you're actually more out of money than you thought, right? The mistake was the wrong way. Sad but true. Or you can make a small mistake but you're massively out of money. Poor sap. Alright, so that is invalid. Okay, number 4, James.
I only have 2 hands. I can't make letter take out the trash too, since I'm making dinner and then take out the trash.
Not much of a multitasker, are you? Well, probably just as well if it involves trash and dinner. Okay, what important word is conspicuously absent? The word or. You'd think that would be important in a disjunctive syllogism, and in fact you'd be right. So this is one of those occasions when you can say a disjunction without saying the word or, because you say something logically equivalent to it. But let's skip over that part first and just symbolize the non-disjunction parts. Alright, so what's the second premise in words as it's written here? I'm making dinner. Yeah, because it says since I'm making dinner, and since means it's a premise. So let's say D for that. D for I'm making dinner. And what's the conclusion?
Not taking out the trash.
I'm not taking out the trash. Okay. That reminds me of, you kids won't remember this, but I actually went to see Jurassic Park in the theaters. And that summer, there were two movies, and there was this big argument over which was going to be the bigger blockbuster. And there were, equal camps on both sides. One of them was Jurassic Park, and the other one was an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie called Last Action Hero. Turns out that one died a death. That was like that was the end of Arnie's cinematic career, really. But there was a good tagline for that. The premise was weird. It was like there was this magic movie ticket, and he appeared in all these different movies within the movie. And one of them was Arnold Schwarzenegger plays Hamlet. And the tagline was, "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, and I'm taking out the trash." So that's what I was thinking. The rest of the movie apparently was correct. Alright, so great. They made fun of it in the Simpsons episode. There's a character in The Simpsons called McBain, who's obviously Arnold Schwarzenegger. He gets mocked at some dinner party about that. Magic ticket my ass, McBain. Totally irrelevant to this, but still. Okay, so first, now we have this absence where there should be a disjunction. What, in fact, does it say? Let's symbolize what it says. Well, before we symbolize what it says, we're going to need one more symbol. Guess what the symbol is for and? And movies is relevant because you often see this in the title of movies.
Ampersand.
Ampersand, yes, that's right. And ampersand is the word, which people sometimes have trouble with. People also have trouble with drawing it, so I'm going to teach you now. Start at the bottom, backwards slash, then backwards S. And you've got yourself a beauty. Do that 50 times and you'll be ready for the class. Alright, so that's the symbol for and, which is called the conjunction. Now, what it says is, I only have two hands, it's just whining. That's not really part of the argument. The argument is, I can't make dinner and take out the trash too. Or another way of putting this is, I can't both make dinner and take out the trash. So the way you symbolize this is using parentheses, which is kind of complicated. We're not going to really get into using parentheses till after the midterm. But basically it's saying this. Oh, that's not such a different percent. There we go. Fixed it. Not, parentheses, D and T. I can't do both of them. That is equivalent to a disjunction. Okay, so it's gonna involve the wedge. Guess what disjunction it's equivalent to?
Not D.
D or T. Let's think about that. How can we work out if it's equivalent to it? Well, if it's equivalent, then it'll have the same truth conditions. In other words, anything that makes this true will also make this true. Remember, that's what we've learned about meaning the same. What do we know about this? We know that the or is inclusive. So that means it's possible for both of these to be true at once. What does that tell us? It tells us that these can't be equivalent. Why not?
Because the other one says that you cannot be.
Yes, because this explicitly says, I can't do both of them. They can't both be true. Whereas this one allows for both of them to be true. So this isn't the disjunction that is equivalent to this. But clearly it's going to involve a disjunction, and it's got to involve D and T. So what disjunction is equivalent to this?
Exclusive or?
No, we're not allowed to use exclusive or, we have to use inclusive or. Yes! Not D or not T. If you know it's not both, you know that it's not one or not the other. And in fact, that is the way of doing exclusive or. Although it's not quite, because this allows the possibility that it's neither, whereas exclusive or means that it has to be at least one. All right, so.
But because she's saying she can do them together, it means she can do one at a time.
She can't do both, and we're talking about a specific time period. So, yeah, that's another thing. Logic, we're now moving into the realm of symbolic logic. And symbolic logic is supposed to capture the important stuff about everyday language. But it is actually a very simple and simplistic language, and we have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions. And one of the things we ignore in logic is tense. We don't care about times of things. We're just talking about states of affairs. So think of it in as like caveman language. You know, is trash removal happening or is dinner happening? One of them, only one of them can happen. Trash happen or dinner happen. So what she's saying is I can't do both. Now that leaves open the possibility that she does neither. But what it can't allow is that she does both. So it can't be D or T, but it can be not D or not T. That's actually a rule of logic, that the negation of D and T is equivalent to not D or not T is actually a law called De Morgan's law. But you don't need to know that yet. After the midterm you'll need to know it.
Is that what binary addition is? Is that what that talks about?
That's something else. Well, don't even bring that up. But yes, these kind of rules, or and such, are useful in... When I was a teenage nerd, I actually learned machine code for 8-bit computers.
Wow.
Because
Sounds painful, man.
well, it was the only way you could write fast games. Okay, because if you wrote a game in BASIC, it would be incredibly slow. Whereas, and actually, you have to know about binary, and that's where I first came across this idea of or, because ones and O's are like equivalent to true and false in logic. So 1 or 0 is 1 because it's basically saying if one of these is true and the other one is false, then the whole thing is true. And the only way that you could get 0 is if you had 0 or 0. And the only way you can get a disjunction be false is false if they're both false. But everybody who hates math, you didn't hear that, okay? It's totally irrelevant. All right. Here is the symbolization of our argument. First premise, not D or not T. Second premise, D. Conclusion, not T. Is it valid? Yes or no?
Yes.
You say it is valid. Anyone say it isn't valid? Why are the rest of you silent?
Because it
You're
doesn't
chicken. Well, I gave you a rule. What is the rule?
if it negates the,
If it denies if the second premise denies one of the disjuncts. What is the second premise? D. What is the disjunct? Not D.
therefore it's valid.
So it is valid because D is the denial of not D. Now, what confused you is probably you were using shorthand. You were saying, okay, all I have to do is look for a tilde in the premise. If there's a tilde in the premise, then it's valid. No, because if one of the disjuncts is not D, then D will be the denial of that. Okay? All right, let's skip over number 5 because it's depressing. And look at number 6. Chris.
Joshua must be literal because conservative isn't conservative.
All right. What kind of thing is this? I'll give you a hint. It begins with E. It's an enthymeme. That's right. What is an enthymeme?
It's an argument with a missing premise.
Yeah, specifically what kind of argument?
Syllogism.
A syllogism. So it's a two-premise argument with one of the, well, sometimes it's the conclusion, but in this case it's one of the premises. Yes, and which premise is missing? The disjunction. So it's a disjunctive syllogism, only we haven't got the disjunctive premise. All right, well, let's symbolize what we have got. What's the conclusion, Chris?
Because he certainly isn't.
No, what is the word because is an indicator for a premise.
It must be a little.
Okay, so yeah, let's use L. What does L stand for, Jordan? What does it stand for?
Jackson is a liberal?
Thank you. Thank you. You got there in the end. Because, of course, it's a proposition. Jackson is a liberal. All right, what's the premise that we're given, Chris?
C is not conservative.
So let's symbolize that as tilde C. So, Jordan, what does C stand for?
Jackson is not conservative.
No. Why doesn't it stand for Jackson? Actually, this is important. What does C stand for?
Jackson is a conservative.
Jackson is a conservative. How do we symbolize he's not a conservative? We stick a tilde in front of it. That's where the not is. And remember, this is a parallel point to cast your mind back to when we were doing categorical propositions, and we had that funny one about John F. Kennedy was not successful in his foreign policy. Now that illustrated two things. One of the things was that you had to use universals when you had individual names. But the other one was we could either have done all John F. Kennedys are things that are not successful, or we could have said no John F. Kennedys are things that are successful. Which one did I say we had to do? So we could either have said all John F. Kennedys are things that are not successful, or we could say no John F. Kennedys are things that are successful. I said you had to go with which one?
No.
What's that?
If you're the one that said no,
Why?
because the first one means that there are some that could be successful.
No, well, that was a different point. No,
Oh, okay.
it was to do with defining the terms. I always wanted you to define the terms affirmatively.
It's not a brick.
Right, right. We don't want to define, we don't have groups of things defined as things that aren't bricks. Right? That doesn't make sense. That's not helpful. So, similarly here, the proposition should be affirmative. Why? Because we've got a perfectly good symbol to represent not. And we want to use that to make it clear when something is saying something negative. We want so keep your nots out in the open. Don't build them into your letters. Don't have your letter stand for, Jackson is not a conservative. Have your letter stand for Jackson is a conservative and then have the not outside. So I noticed on one of your homeworks it referred to the Boy Scout rule. Sometimes I say this, the Boy Scout rule is keep your knots out in the open. That is, I don't know why I call that, it's totally random, it's just not, Boy Scouts care about not tying knots, forget it. But the point is, make sure that if there's a knot there, you symbolize it with a tilde and you define your letters affirmatively. Okay. What is the implied missing premise?
Either Jackson is a liberal or he is a conservative.
Those are two possibilities. One of them would make this argument valid and the other one wouldn't. Actually, yes, and it's yours that would make it valid. Either Jackson is a conservative or Jackson is a liberal. If that is our missing premise, is this a valid argument? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we still might say it's not a good argument. It's valid, so logically it's good. What's the problem with it?
It could be something that's not. It could be moderate.
Yes, in other words, the problem with it is this is actually in reality false. But of course logic doesn't care about that because that's something to do with the content. The content determines whether or not this is in reality false. We just care about the form, and the form is a valid one. In sort of informal logic, this commits a fallacy called false dilemma. Yes, false dilemma, or fallacy of black and white thinking. What is a dilemma?
You have two options and no others.
When you have only two options, di prefix meaning two. And usually they're both bad ones, you know, like rock in a hard place, devil in the deep blue sea, Scylla and Charybdis, that kind of thing.
What's the difference between that and the false dichotomy?
Nothing.
Okay,
The word, that's it.
okay,
Um,
that's what I thought.
Okay, yeah, so, whereas in this case, of course, a false dilemma or a false dichotomy is one where you say there are two options, when in fact there are more options. So obviously Jackson could be neither. He could say, I don't give a crap about politics. Okay, but logically that is a valid argument. Alright, I think that'll do it for disjunctions. Because now we're going to talk about hypothetical propositions. And hypothetical propositions and syllogisms are a bit more complicated than disjunctions, although they have a lot in common. So, let's talk about hypothetical or conditional propositions. And I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Hypothetical propositions are conditional propositions. You'll see why it's hypothetical immediately, and you'll see why it's conditional in a little bit. Hypothetical / conditional propositions. Now, in fact, every hypothetical proposition is logically equivalent to a disjunctive proposition. So, they have very similar elements. Just as disjunctive propositions have two disjuncts, which are themselves propositions, so a hypothetical proposition also has two smaller propositions, joined together by a logical word. And instead of the logical word being or, the logical word is then. And wherever there's a then, you will see what ahead of this one? If. So it is an if-then statement. Now, cast your minds back to the mists of time at the beginning of the semester, and we actually talked about ands and ors and if-thens. Can you remember in what context? Let me say a word that might send chills of horror down your spine. Assert. The assert and express distinction. Remember that stuff? Well, yes. Remember, suppose I say A and B. Suppose I say a sentence that is A and B. So like today is Wednesday and this is logic. And I tell you that whole sentence is true. If that whole sentence is true, what do you know about today is Wednesday?
True.
It's true. What do you know about this is logic?
It's true.
It's true. So that means in that sentence both the component parts are asserted. And that's what and does. However, replace it with the word or. So suppose I say, I either have coins or keys in my pocket. Suppose that's true. Do you know that I have coins in my pocket?
No.
No. Do you know that I have keys in my pocket?
No.
No. So in that case, neither is asserted. Remember that? So that's the logical difference between and or. What about if then? Suppose I say, if I have coins in my pocket, then I have keys in my pocket. And I tell you that's true. Do you know I have coins in my pocket?
No.
Do you know if I have keys in my pocket?
No.
No. So just like or, neither of these is asserted. Okay, so that's a similarity right there. Now there's a difference between disjunctions and hypotheticals. Disjunctive propositions you can call disjunctions, and hypothetical propositions you can call hypotheticals. Now, does it matter with disjunctions? Does it matter which order you write it? In other words, is A or B the same as B or A?
Yes.
Yes, it is. There is a name for this feature that you might have learned in math. It is called the property of it not mattering which order you write it. What was that? Commutativity. Now, before I scare you with math, all of you are familiar with arithmetic, right? You learned that a very long time ago. What arithmetic functions, let's say there are only 4, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, which are the commutative ones? Addition, multiplication. 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2. They both equal 5. And 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2. They both equal 6. Disjunction is like that. It's commutative. What about subtraction? Is that commutative? No, because 3 minus 2 is 1, but 2 minus 3 is negative 1. Not the same. Hypotheticals. Let's work out if they're commutative or not. Well, tell me, is this true? And of course I had to bring up whales. If you're a whale, then you're a mammal. Is that true?
Sure.
Yes. Is this true? If you're a mammal, then you're a whale.
No.
No. What have we just learned about hypotheticals? They are not commutative. Okay, so that's one difference. And because of that difference, whereas we call both of the elements in a disjunction the same. We call them both disjuncts. They were interchangeable. We're going to have to give 2 different names for the 2 components because the order matters. The first one we call the antecedent. So the antecedent is itself a proposition, like today is Monday or whatever. What does the prefix ante with an E mean?
Before.
Before, yes. Who has heard the word antebellum? Okay, I understand there is a country music group called Lady Antebellum. I have never heard them, knowingly. Although I've been in a lot of waiting rooms, so maybe I've heard them. What does the word antebellum mean?
Before war.
Before the war, yeah, and usually in America it means before the Civil War. So people talk about the antebellum South, means the South before the Civil War. All right, but ante means before, the one that gets most people is when do you ante up in poker? At the start, right? Before you start. Okay. The second one is called the consequent. Consequent with a T. But when do consequences happen?
After the fact.
After the fact. So ante before, consequent after. All right. So the one between the if and the then is the antecedent. The one after the then is called the consequent. All right, so far. Now, it turns out that there are several non-standard ways of writing a hypothetical. And we'll get to translating those into... So standard form for hypothetical propositions looks like this. First word if, then the antecedent, then the word then the consequent. But it doesn't look like that. It's not in standard form for hypothetical propositions. And you can get some that aren't in standard form. We'll get to that in a second. But before we get to that, I'm going to teach you something that I teach in every class that I teach because it's so dang important. And that is and this is actually the reason why these are also called conditional propositions. Because I'm going to teach you 2 kinds of condition. The first one is called necessary. Why is it called a condition? Well, conditions are, things that have to be true for something else to happen. Okay, a necessary condition. Let's say in quotes. P is necessary. So here you go, Zainab. Here's your P's and Q's. P is necessary for Q means you can't have, and you finish the sentence. You know what necessary means.
You can have Q without P.
You can't have Q without P. Why? Because you gotta have it. That's what necessary means. You can't have Q without P. Okay. The other kind of condition, does anyone know?
Sufficient.
Sufficient, yes. Okay, P is sufficient for Q. And, oh, incidentally, you can either say sufficient for, or you can say is a sufficient condition. And the same thing applies to necessary. So you can either just say P is necessary for Q, or you can say P is a necessary condition. So P is sufficient, or P is a sufficient condition for Q means P guarantees Q. That's right. What is another word for sufficient beginning with E? Suppose someone's filling my wine glass and I'm very fancy, I might say that's sufficient. What would be a better way of saying it? Enough, yes. So sufficient means enough. So if P is sufficient for Q, P is enough to ensure that you already have Q. Or another way of putting that is P guarantees Q. All right, those definitions are a little abstract. Let's come up with a couple of examples. Having gas in your tank, let's say that's P, what kind of condition is that for your car starting? You say necessary. Now, here's an important point. Showing that something is necessary is not the same as showing that it's not sufficient, because you can have something be both necessary and sufficient for something else, and you can have something be neither necessary nor sufficient. So it's not enough to show that something is not sufficient to show that it is necessary. So why is it necessary? Why is having gas in your tank necessary for your car starting? There you go. You can't start your car without gas, unless you've got a Nissan Leaf, but you don't, do you? Nobody in Michigan drives an electric car. Maybe 2 people in Ann Arbor. Okay, so that's necessary. Why isn't it, or well, no, well, I've kind of given it away. Is it sufficient?
No.
All right, why not?
Well, fuel in the vehicle doesn't start it.
Yes, you can have a full tank of gas.
And the car still won't start
And
for
it-
other mechanical reasons.
Right, because you left your headlights on overnight, like an idiot. I'm talking about myself here. Or, you know, somebody stole your engine. You got a full tank of gas, but your car isn't going to start. All right, so it's necessary but not sufficient. How about this? Standing next to a nuclear explosion is what kind of condition for you dying? Sufficient. Why is it sufficient? Because that'll do it, right? That being atomized brings about death. Okay. Is it necessary? It's standing next to.
There are a lot more ways to die.
Yes, that's a cheerful thought, isn't it? There are many ways to die. So it is not necessary. So explosion is sufficient for death, but not necessary. All right. How about this? Is smoking, what kind of condition is smoking for getting lung cancer? First of all, is smoking sufficient for lung cancer?
Cause it, sure.
No. What kind of person proves that smoking is not sufficient? Someone who smokes but does not get cancer. The lucky bastard, right? Is smoking necessary for getting lung cancer?
No.
No. What kind of person proves that?
Mesothelioma, someone who inhales asbestos or any other form of lung cancer that develops outside of smoking.
Like Walter White, for example. Who's he? Breaking Bad. The main character in Breaking Bad who gets lung cancer despite not smoking because he's a chemistry teacher. And they breathe in noxious fumes all the time. Yes. So the unlucky bastard proves that it's not necessary. So the lucky bastard proves that it's not sufficient, and the unlucky bastard proves that it's not necessary. Now notice, of course, there is a correlation. Don't take up smoking because of this, right? There is a correlation. It's just not the kind of solid correlation that is talked about in here. All right. Now, why am I bringing this up in this context? Because the antecedent is one of these for the consequent. Which one? Well, being a whale is what kind of condition for being a mammal? Sufficient. If you're a whale, then you're a mammal. So, what's the relationship? Sufficient. This is saying, if this is true, it's saying that this brings about this. This guarantees this. So the antecedent is sufficient for the consequent. Here's another question. Can you be a whale without being a mammal?
No.
No. So being a mammal is necessary for being a whale. So the consequent is necessary for the antecedent. And that will be important when, for a couple of reasons that I guess we'll have to get to next time. But before I let you go, I want to very quickly summarize 3 common ways of stating a hypothetical in non-standard form. This is standard form. It begins with the word if, then you state the antecedent, then you say then, and then you state the consequent. But how about this? P, comma, if Q. State that in standard form. If something, then something else.
If Q, then P.
If Q, then P, that's right. This would be, you're dead if you jump off that building, would be, if you jump off that building, then you're dead. That's just a quirk of English that you can do that. Essentially, the antecedent is what follows the if, and you put the consequent at the start. So the if remains together with Q. Here's a very important one. P only if Q. Now, the only makes a difference. Here's the difference that it makes. Is this true? You will win the lottery only if you buy a ticket. Is that true? Yes. Is this true? You will win the lottery if you buy a ticket. No. The one that says this, you will win the lottery if you buy a ticket, implies that buying a ticket is sufficient for you winning the lottery. That's not true. But buying a ticket is necessary, because you can't win the lottery without having a ticket. So, what is this in standard form? If P, then Q. So look at the effect that the word only has. It has the effect of switching, which we called conversion when we were talking about categorical propositions and terms, and we still use that term when we're talking about hypotheticals and propositions. Last one, P unless Q. Here's the easy way to think about this, and it is unless is equivalent to if not. So what's that? What is P unless Q equivalent to? If not Q, then P. So you're dead unless you drink water. Means if you don't drink water, then you're dead. Such a lot of death in logic. It's a bloody field. All right, I will post the homework sometime later today. I'm sure you'll be on the edge of your seat until then.